There's a specific kind of person most men encounter at least once, maybe twice, and almost nobody recognizes them in time. They don't announce themselves. They don't show up with a warning sign on their forehead. They show up with charm, with attention, with an intensity that feels, for the first time in a long time, like being genuinely seen. By the time you understand what you've actually been dealing with, you've already given them access to things that take years to rebuild. Your confidence, your trust, your sense of what's real, the quiet baseline you used to have before they arrived. This isn't a video about hating anyone. It's a video about a psychological profile that's been studied, documented, and replicated across decades of clinical research. 9 things. 3 things narcissists hate. 3 things they do. 3 things they are. By the end, you won't see certain people the same way again. That's not a threat, that's a gift. You should have gotten this information a long time ago. Most people assume narcissists hate criticism. They don't. Criticism still gives them something: attention, reaction, proof they matter enough to be argued with. A narcissist would rather be hated than ignored. Hate is still a form of being important. What they cannot tolerate is indifference. The second you stop reacting, stop engaging, stop visibly caring what they do, something breaks. Clinically, it's called narcissistic injury. The gap between the image they hold of themselves and the version reflected back at them by someone who isn't impressed. When you go cold, when your replies become short and emotionless, when you stop being a reliable source of feeling, you become useless to them. And useless to a narcissist is more threatening than any argument you could ever win. This is why the gray rock method works. Not because you disappear, because you become boring. A flat surface, nothing for them to grip onto. No emotional return on the energy they're putting in. When there's nothing to feed on, they leave. Sometimes loudly, but they leave. There's a difference between confronting a narcissist in private and confronting them in front of other people. In private, they can minimize, they can reframe, they can convince you that your perception is the actual problem, and you'll walk away from the conversation apologizing for something they did. You've been there. Most men have. In public, the mask becomes a liability, because the mask exists for the audience, and when that audience watches the contradiction in real time between who they claim to be and who they actually are, the entire construction is at risk. This is why narcissists respond to public exposure with disproportionate fury. It's not embarrassment, it's existential. Their identity is built on perception management, on controlling what other people believe about them. The moment that control breaks, the person underneath has nothing to stand on. Because they spent decades not building anything underneath, the mask was the whole structure. You don't need to expose a narcissist to protect yourself from one. That's not the lesson. The lesson is what their fear of exposure tells you. They're not as powerful as they appear. They're dependent on your silence, on your compliance, on your agreement to keep playing inside their version of reality. Withdraw that agreement, quietly, without announcement, and watch how fast the power inverts. Narcissists are constantly performing. The car, the status, the name drops, the carefully edited story of their life, delivered to make you feel like you're lucky to be near them. This works on most people, because most people want to believe in the performance. It's nice to think the impressive person is exactly as impressive as they say. But there's a specific kind of person a narcissist cannot handle. Someone who's just not impressed, not hostile, not dismissive, not playing the opposite game of putting them down, just unaffected. This response short-circuits everything. The entire interaction was built around extracting admiration from you, and when that admiration doesn't come, they escalate. They push harder, they add to the story, they raise the stakes of the performance. And when it still doesn't land, they do one of 2 things. They either devalue you, suddenly you were never that interesting anyway, or they become obsessed with getting your approval, because your approval is the only one that ever felt like it was worth something. Either way, you've already won. You've revealed that their power over you was never real. it was rented, and you stopped paying. This is one of the most disorienting things you'll ever experience. A conversation happens, an event occurs, something is said clearly in front of you, and then later, when you reference it, it didn't happen that way, or it didn't happen at all, or you're the one who said it, or you're misremembering because you've always been too emotional to keep things straight. This is gaslighting, and it isn't an accident, it's a strategy. The goal isn't to correct the record. The goal is to make you doubt the record itself, because a person who doesn't trust their own perception is a person who will defer to someone else's. Researchers in coercive control have documented this exhaustively. The consistent rewriting of shared history creates a psychological dependency in the target, where they begin to rely on the abuser's version of events because their own memory feels unreliable. This is manufactured. You're not confused, you're being confused. Those are very different sentences. The defense is simple, but it requires discipline. Document things. Save the texts. Write down the dates. Not because you're paranoid, because memory is the only thing you have when someone is systematically trying to take it from you. Trust the version of events you recorded before anyone had a reason to change them. Narcissists don't immediately violate your boundaries. That would be too obvious, too easy to see and reject. What they do is probe. A small request that feels slightly off. A comment that crosses a line by an inch. A demand disguised as a joke. Something you can't quite call them out for without sounding dramatic. Then they watch you. If you say nothing, they take note. If you laugh it off, they take note. If you push back, they apologize, they reframe, they tell you you're being sensitive, and then they wait a few weeks and test again. Slightly different angle, same purpose. This is boundary testing, and it's methodical. The narcissist is mapping you, finding out exactly where you'll hold the line and where you'll fold. The map they build becomes the operating manual for how to control you long-term. Most people never realize this is happening because each individual test seems too small to react to. It's only when you step back 6 months later, 2 years later, and look at the pattern that you see what was actually being built. A systematic search for your weakest point. The only way to stop it is to make yourself unmappable. Hold the line on things that don't matter, sometimes just to be unpredictable. Enforce consequences immediately, the first time, not the fourth. Don't negotiate when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate why yet. A person who can't find your edge can't use it against you. Healthy relationships don't have an opponent. There's no third party in the room. There's no one to compete with. Narcissistic relationships always have an opponent. Sometimes it's an ex. Sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes it's a version of yourself from before you met them. The competition is never real, but the feeling it creates absolutely is. The clinical term is triangulation, the introduction of a third element to destabilize your sense of security. And it's designed to do one specific thing. Keep you working, keep you proving, keep you running on a low-grade anxiety that makes you easier to manage. Because an anxious person is a compliant person. When you're afraid of losing something, you'll tolerate things you would never have tolerated at the start. You'll accept less. You'll give more. You'll suppress instincts that used to protect you because those instincts now feel like a threat to what you have. Recognize triangulation the moment it appears. It'll show up dressed as honesty, as transparency, as "I just want to be open with you about this." Its function is always the same, to make you feel replaceable, so you stop acting like you have options. Everything you've heard so far, the control, the manipulation, the performance, is built on something most people never consider: fear. Not the fear of losing power, something older than that. The fear of being seen as nothing. Narcissistic personality disorder, as documented in the DSM-5, is understood by most researchers as a defense structure, a fortress built over a core of deep shame. Most narcissists didn't sit down one day and decide to become what they are. They built the personality they built because at some point, usually early, usually before they could fight back. Their actual self felt like something that had to be hidden, buried, replaced with something better, harder, less reachable. Something that could never be humiliated again. This doesn't excuse the damage they cause. Don't get this confused. Understanding the wound doesn't mean staying in the room while it's being passed to you. But it explains the internal logic. The grandiosity isn't confidence, it's noise covering silence. The aggression when challenged isn't strength, it's the response of someone who can't afford to let any crack appear, because if one crack appears, the whole structure goes. You're not dealing with someone who's powerful, you're dealing with someone who is terrified of being powerless, and has gotten very, very good at not showing it. This is the piece most people resist, because it sounds extreme. Surely everyone has some empathy. Surely nobody is completely without it. For most people, that's true, but research consistently distinguishes between two different things. Cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what someone else is feeling. Reading the room, recognizing the signs. And affective empathy, the ability to actually feel it with them, to be moved by it. Narcissists, especially those scoring high on clinical assessments, tend to have high cognitive empathy and dramatically reduced affective empathy. They can understand you're in pain, they just don't feel it in the way that would change their behavior. This is why the apologies feel hollow, why the remorse evaporates within 48 hours, why the same wound gets inflicted again and again, despite hours of conversation, despite tears, despite every attempt you've made to explain how much it costs you. You're not failing to explain yourself clearly enough. You haven't found the right words yet, because the right words don't exist. You're speaking a language they can translate, but cannot speak. There's nothing more you can do, no better argument, no more compelling story. You cannot reach someone with emotions they are not wired to receive. Once you accept that, really accept it, not just intellectually agree with it, a lot of things get easier, including leaving. This is the final one, and it's the most important. When you spend extended time with a narcissistic person, something happens to your perception of yourself. Because the relationship is built around their reality, you gradually start to see yourself through their eyes. Their assessment of your worth, their version of your potential, their definition of what you deserve. And because they're skilled at making that version feel like love, at least at the start, you begin to believe it. This is the deepest damage, not the specific things they did, the fact that somewhere along the way, you started to agree with their version of you. You internalize the criticism, the voice telling you that you weren't enough, that you were too much, that you were lucky to be tolerated. At some point, that voice stopped sounding like theirs and started sounding like yours. Recovering from a narcissistic relationship isn't just about leaving the person. That's the easy part. The hard part is reclaiming your own perception. Relearning how to assess your own value without running it through someone else's filter first. It's slow work. It's uncomfortable work. There's no shortcut, but it's the only work that matters. Because as long as you're still looking into that mirror, you're still in the relationship, even if they've been gone for years. 9 things. 3 they hate, 3 they do, 3 they are. None of this is abstract. Every pattern in this video has been documented, studied, and replicated across thousands of clinical cases. This isn't philosophy, it's psychology. The reason most people never protect themselves isn't because they're weak. It's because nobody ever sat them down and gave them the information. They were taught to lead with trust, to assume the best, to believe everyone is capable of the same care they extend. That's a beautiful instinct. In the wrong hands, it's also the most expensive one you own. The goal isn't to become cynical. Cynics live small lives too. The goal is to become calibrated, to know the difference between someone who is difficult and someone who is dangerous. To recognize the patterns early, before they have time to become familiar, before familiar becomes normal, before normal becomes something you tolerate because you've forgotten what it felt like before. Protect your trust. Protect your perception. Protect the version of yourself that existed before anyone told you it wasn't enough. Follow Psych warfare. This is only the beginning.